Well, welcome back. We're talking about the growing threat from global climate change. Let's get back to our panel right now. Let's go to Benny. Benny, I was looking at some figures here for the United States. A record number of Americans, 45%, now say they worry, quote, a great deal about global warming, and that's up from 37% a year ago and well above what it was in 2011, which was 25%. To what do you attribute this change in sentiment?
Oh, it always happens. If you look back at polls over the last 20 years, whenever there is a kind of natural disaster hitting the US, the numbers go up, and then after a while they drop back. They haven't really changed in the last 20 years, and it's very partisan as well. So many more Democrats are afraid of climate change. Republicans tend to be less concerned. They have more economic or international policy issues. The polls haven't really changed, and in any case, most people, if you ask what their main concerns are, tend to list the environment and climate fairly at the bottom of their list of concerns. So that hasn't changed and is unlikely to change in the long term. As I said, whenever a hurricane or hurricanes hit the US, the numbers go temporarily up and then they fall down to a kind of average level again. I don't expect that to change in the future.
David, is that your experience as well, that it's a pretty low priority, the environment?
I think the trend is changing, and it has come up as your numbers show. And Benny's making a mistake to assume that the past 30 years is a guide to the weather of the next 30 years, and the past 30 years is a guide to the politics of the next 30 years. We're seeing big change and generational change. People care about this to a level they never did before. It isn't a single issue, but it fits into a complex of issues that they care about and that moves them and is moving the politics in this country. You see in some very recent election results in this country very strong swings against the Republicans and in favor of the Democrats. And the predictions, which of course, are volatile, but the predictions are for quite an interesting election this November. And I think climate change is one of the issues that animates especially young people, especially Latinos, especially women, and it's registering as an important thing.
Alvin, the South China Morning Post, the Hong Kong-based newspaper, reported late last year that China is going to be stepping up its coordination with European countries in the fight against global warming, and that in the wake of the United States' decision to pull out of the Paris climate deal. How is China going to be going about this? What kind of coordination can we expect to see?
Well, I think both countries and regions can learn a lot from each other. One example, for example, is China's now putting a price on carbon. It's come out with its national carbon cap and trade system. And so that will be happening first within the power sector to put a price on carbon. And that's going to be changing investment decisions. So how exactly is the best way to operate these cap and trade systems to price carbon? I think that is something that China has been taking lessons from the EU, and that there will continue to be good exchange on that. And then the other area is energy efficiency, renewables. These are all areas where both sides have done a lot, and I think can really learn a lot more from each other on how to strengthen these.
Dylan, there was a study done by the Nature Climate Change, which said that more than 25% of the world's land would dry up with an average increase in temperature of 2 degrees Celsius. What would that mean?
Good question. So with a growing population, we're going to have to feed billions more people around the world. So obviously, with less land, that's going to become much more harder to do. In terms of providing clean water to communities around the world, that's going to be a lot harder to do. Arable land is going to increase, desertification is going to potentially move into more and more communities, whether that's in China or here in the United States. So the way in which but at the same time, we have a lot of tools at hand to really tackle this head on. Better water management, better agricultural practices, fighting against desertification. These are all things that we can, up to a point, try and address. If we are, though, going to allow this to go on for another 30 years, it gets to the point where you reach 5, 6 degrees centigrade warming, perhaps mid to late century, if we go on not addressing this issue like we're doing, where we have fewer and fewer tools at hand to address this at scale.
Right, the tools may be there, but is it a race against the clock?
Good question. So I like to think of it as climate change as a whole is analogous to a smoking habit, right? So we've been doing this for centuries. We've been, every year that we continue these practices, we bake in worse and worse outcomes for ourselves. So we find ourselves at this point. There was a recent intergovernmental panel on climate change report that's going to be coming out at the end of this year that's looking at, can we limit ourselves to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius in the coming decades? And they're saying the longer we put off some really tough decisions and really tackle this head on, the harder it's going to be for us without breakthrough technologies in the immediate future to really handle this. So urgent actions needed to be taken today.
David, I want to get back to something you were talking about a moment ago, and that is, has this issue become too politicized?
Well, it's very unfortunate that it has in the United States. It's one of many issues that have become highly politicized. If you look back to the 1970s and 80s, and even the beginning of the 1990s, environmental policy was bipartisan. The champs were almost evenly distributed in the Republican and the Democratic parties. The Republican Party made a strategic decision to abandon that ground, to align itself more and more in this area and some others with incumbent corporate interests, in this case the oil, gas, coal interests. And they dug themselves into a hole, a political hole, because it's not a sustainable position. We would like to be able to find more people in both parties to work with, not just on one side. And the United States has got a big problem if we can't break this general political polarization that's developed on many issues, not just this one.
Benny, getting back to go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I just pitch in there?
Yeah.
I think what has changed in the U.S. and what has changed the whole debate in the U.S. is in the 70s and 80s and parts of the 90s, the Americans were so concerned that they were running out of oil and gas that they were arguing for renewable energy and alternatives to fossil fuels. And then the shale revolution has completely changed the whole energy landscape, both in the US and internationally. And now the Republicans are basically saying the US has to take advantage of these huge resources. And ironically, the shift from coal to gas has meant that of all countries in the world, the US is the one nation that has dramatically reduced its CO2 emissions. No other nation in the world has managed to reduce its CO2 emissions as much as the US on the back of this shale revolution. And that is also why other countries now are beginning to backtrack. Think about Europe. Think about Germany, which has just announced that they will abandon its legally binding climate targets. Think about the EU, which has just decided to abandon legally binding targets for renewable energy. Right. Many countries are backtracking because we're swimming in this new, cheap energy.
Okay, I know you want to respond to that, David. Go ahead.
Well, it is interesting that gas is eating coal's lunch. And in the short run, that does mean an emission reduction. But also happening is this second revolution in energy efficiency and in renewables. And these are coming up fast. And they are giving gas a run for its money. So that's where the future is. And the United States is going to do very, very well on efficiency and renewables. But I would say that what you have is a conflict between industries in the United States. And the Republican Party would do well to look to the future industry, not just the past industry.
Okay, Alvin, very quickly, I want to address one issue. Go ahead, Benny. We'll finish off with you.
Yeah, I think everyone is in favor of renewables as long as the poor don't have to support the rich for their wind turbines and solar panels.
Right.
I think they have to become competitive, and all the kind of payments from the poor families to the rich families who want to show how green they are has to stop.
In the interest of time,
at that moment, I think the renewables.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to all of you for being with us.